Well, prior to my sister Jane's death, I had a BBC that was sort of brewing that I wanted to share about, and I think it still is relevant to share today. So during the Exploring Monastic Life, Venerable started the teachings by saying that instead of teaching on love and bliss, she was going to be free to be a little bit more direct and upfront about what she wanted to teach, very much like giving us a bigger, real picture, like the first two noble truths, the truth of dukkha and its causes, and that we have this noticeable disadvantage in our culture because we're raised believing that life is love and bliss and truly amazing, and that we can get whatever we want. Just look around us; it's spectacular. And how can it be as bad as the Buddha says it is? Why worry about dukkha? Why worry about death? Why worry about karma? It's so depressing. And so she referred to this fantasy. She said that we have this I am invincible fantasy, this erroneous way of thinking that really accurately defines our inability to deeply know and understand the first two noble truths. And so I think all of us probably have a version of our own invincibility in our life. I thought for decades that I was young, I was strong, I was on my own, I was living life on my terms, doing what I wanted to do, right? This is how great life was. But now that I have a Dharma perspective and a much longer view of my life, I can see that a result of this erroneous way of thinking is that I did some pretty foolish, some pretty unkind, some pretty reckless, some pretty harmful things in my life, which I am now still honestly purifying. A tiny bit wiser, but now that I'm older and that this little guest house here is becoming much more dilapidated, the misconceptions are also starting to crumble. So I've had death a lot on my mind these days. And I think as long as when the invincibility thoughts are still running in my mind, and they are even at 63 years of age, that I don't think about the first noble truth. I don't think about samsara. I don't think about how we got here while we still continue to circulate through samsara, as long as this, as subtle as it can get sometimes for me, that I'm still immortal, I'm still invincible, I still have time, I'm totally focused on the happiness of this life. And I'm not going to die, at least I'm not going to die right now. So I wanted to share with you, because as this past year too, I think because of, I don't know, just being more in touch with my own fragility, is that I wanted to share some experiences here at the Abbey that demonstrate how I, and I'm going to name maybe probably a few other people in the community, held the belief of invincibility even after meeting the Dharma, after practicing it, even after I moved here, even after the age of 50, I still have this very strong feeling that I am invincible. When really, in case, I'm hardly invincible, but a far more mortal than I think. So one of the stories that continually plays itself out in my mind in regards to death and impermanence and this precious human life is that in the early years here at the Abbey, when things were settling in, I'd say somewhere between 2005, 2010, the first wave of residents here at the Abbey, we were a pretty wild bunch. At least from my point of view, I think Venerable had her hands full. She was the only monastic here. And even after Venerable Tarpa and I ordained, we were so new to just being guided, being trained, restraining ourselves. We had a few lay people here as well, but I think we needed a lot of attention. I think Venerable had eyes in the back of her head. And at that time in my life, even though I had moved here, I still had very, very strong ideas that certain worldly things were fun, regardless on how reckless, how stupid, how foolish they were, and that I was still invincible. I was still immortal. I had these extremely clear memories regarding our first few years where we had our 3-month silent retreat. I think it was the first time that many of us here had actually sat with our minds, those crazy minds, for that long of a period. We had done some retreats with Venerable. People had come in with some retreat experience, but without any major distractions. It was so hard. So at some point during the first, I think it was the second winter retreat, someone got this great idea of making a sled run from the top of the upper meadow all the way down to the barn. This is how desperate we were to find some distractions from our crazy minds from what was going on the inside. Let's find something dangerous and reckless and foolish to do to give our minds something else to think about except about how out of control they are. The idea was to start up there, and that's quite a ways up to the water system. And depending on how fearless and how foolish you felt on any given day during those retreats, or what the condition of the snow was. If it was icy, chances are you were going to be going a whole lot faster than 15 miles an hour. If it was deep powder, then it was a better chance of getting down to the bottom of the hill. So what you wanted to do was to start up there. Then we had these little red and blue sleds. They were maybe a little bit bigger than maybe that big. And what we did is they were used as food offering sleds in the winter, because before Chenrezig was built, our lay friends would come up when we were in the hall doing our retreat sessions. They'd come and they'd drop all the food off in the workshop in these big Rubbermaid bins. And then during break time, we'd rarely see them. We'd go down with these little sleds and fill in the milk and the tofu, and we'd bring them up to Ananda Hall, which was where we were eating. Okay, well, someone got the idea that those sleds would probably go pretty fast if you started up at the top of the hill on a little sled going about 10 miles, 15 miles an hour, no control, no brakes. And what you wanted to do is you started up at the top of the hill. You'd come down through the trees where the landing is, where the firewood is. You'd try to get through that little tree stand, hit the fire road where Venerable's cabin is, come down between Prajna Cottage and where the meditation hall is now. Come down here, and your whole thing was to get through that 6-foot gate there by the compost bin, make a hard right, go down into the swale, and if you were still alive, how close you could get to the barn. And this is crazy. I mean, I have pictures of me and Venerable Chuni trying to do this tandem on one of those sleds. And I also have a picture of Venerable Tarpa while she rolled off of one of these sleds. She's covered with, from head to foot, and you can't recognize she's just covered in snow. So you get the picture. And we had some younger men at the time. They called it bumper cars. They would take those sleds. They'd go down on the bottom of where the Abbey sign is. They'd get some air off of that hill, and then head on down country lane to see how far they could go. And then if one of our lay friends was coming up with the food offering, they'd hitch themselves to the back of the bumper on that little sled and get pulled up back up the hill. Luckily, in foolish, reckless, endangering our precious human life. I mean, negative karma may not need that many cooperative conditions to ripen, and we were setting up some pretty interesting cooperative conditions for any kind of previous harm we've done to anybody. So luckily, it only lasted a few winters for sure, because I don't know whether Venerable knew it, because she was over in the writing studio, but she got wind of it somehow. And without making a big deal about it, in her wisdom, she said, we have a precious human life, and we want to keep it that way for as long as we can. I mean, we could have crashed into one of those trees. We could have hit that fence at 15 miles an hour without a helmet on. Who knows? But we weren't thinking about samsara. We weren't thinking about karma. We weren't thinking about how we got here under the control of afflictions and karma. We wanted to be distracted from looking at our minds, and maybe to get a little rest from looking at our minds. We really didn't care about the reality of the situation because we're having such a good time. So the lack of knowing or caring that what we do matters. I mean, this is what the whole death, between Jane's death and then, our friend's death last week, it's just bringing this whole idea about, even though death is certain, even though the time of death is uncertain, even though we can't control that, we can do our best to take care of these bodies, to feed them, to treat them well, to rest them, and to do the same for our minds, to feed it with Dharma, to feed it with gratitude, to take care of them. And I've really come to understand, particularly this year, that it's so important because of, we are careening through samsara. I mean, that is at times our lives are that out of control, like on a small sled heading downhill without any brakes, trying to get ourselves into some sort of samsaric tiny little gate that we think is going to be the answer to all of our problems and be the source of all of our happiness. Is that to let go of a lot of the small stuff, to let go of the afflicted states of mind, and just work on them, and to cultivate and nourish our good, hearts, our virtuous activities and motivations. Because more and more, as I said in one of my previous BBCs, I'm seeing very clearly is that what we do with our minds now is what's going to be happening with them at the time of death. And so to have a joy, we can be vigilant, treasure our lives, because we have fun here. We have a lot of joy here at the Abbey, but it's to brighten our minds, to really cultivate a sense of joy and virtue, not to not to amuse and distract ourselves because things are getting hard. We're having to look at some really tender things, some difficult things, but to really brighten our minds. So to be vigilant and to treasure this life, and then to extend that, to share that part with everyone that we meet. But when I think of that memory on how that's such a metaphor for so much a part of our lives that we really are out of control, we don't have a lot of control, although it may look like it. And so to be a lot more vigilant and careful on taking care of this beautiful life that we have for the benefit of all.